was in Professor Blackwood's Advanced Global Studies seminar when the lockdown alert ripped through the overhead speakers. Campus-wide lockdown. Campus-wide lockdown? This is not a drill. We'd run through this 100 times since elementary school. Dim the lights, seek cover, remain absolutely silent. It was second nature. Everyone began to instinctively move, but Professor Blackwood positioned herself directly in our path, wearing that familiar, unyielding expression she adopted whenever her command was questioned. Return to your seats immediately. Her voice carried that sharp edge that left no room for debate. I have not sanctioned any lockdown protocol today. I instinctively raised my hand. But Professor Blackwood, we're mandated to... The only directives you adhere to are mine. Be seated, or your final presentations will all receive failing marks. She then launched into her familiar monologue about her decades of unwavering standards and how her generation thrived on discipline, not constant reassurance. The truth about Professor Blackwood was this: she was meticulously stringent about trivial matters, yet remarkably lax about actual instruction. She'd meticulously mark you tardy for being 30 seconds late, but effortlessly award top grades on assignments she clearly hadn't reviewed. Once, I'd submitted a research paper with an entire passage detailing the origins of fictional unicorn lore embedded midway, just to test her. I received a 98. So, most of us grudgingly settled back down. No one wanted to jeopardize their academic standing over what was likely another overblown exercise. But then the alert repeated, sharper this time. Code red. This is a code red. All personnel and students must implement lockdown procedures without delay. That never happened during drills. They broadcast it once, and that was it. My stomach began to churn with a strange clenching sensation. The same dread I felt before a major examination I hadn't prepared for, only infinitely worse. My gaze kept flicking towards the door. The corridor outside remained brightly illuminated, the fluorescent fixtures glaring. During drills, instructors always extinguished their lights instantly. Then I heard it, sharp cracks, like whip snaps, but not quite. Every device in the room vibrated simultaneously. I retrieved mine covertly beneath my desk. My partner, Trevin Lynch, was in the chemistry wing, 2 corridors away. His text message chilled my blood. Concealed in supply closet, someone has a firearm. Where are you? More messages poured in. Behind filing cabinet in main office. Under Professor Grayson's table. I presented Professor Blackwood with my screen. My partner says there's an individual with a... I comprehend what's transpiring here. You believe you can orchestrate some elaborate deception to discredit me? To jeopardize my employment? The cracking sounds were growing louder. Closer. A scream tore through the hallway. Not a joyous scream, not a playful shriek. That is likely the dramatics ensemble practicing, Professor Blackwood stated, though even her voice lacked its usual certainty. I could glimpse Instructor Price's class across the hall. Lights off. No discernible movement. Just an expanse of shadow where 24 adolescents should have been. My hands trembled so violently I could barely compose a reply. Blackwood refuses to allow us to conceal. Still at desks. Trayvon's response was immediate. What? Seek immediate cover. Bodie Nolan tried next. Sweet Bodie, who never challenged anyone. Professor Blackwood, please. This feels unequivocally real. Sentiments are not empirical facts. Bodie, be seated. More frantic sounds of movement echoed in the hallway. A multitude of footsteps, all rushing in a singular direction. Away from something or someone. The PA system sputtered again, but cut off mid-word. That's when the shots rang out. No longer just cracks. Bang, bang, bang. Like a heavy anvil striking stone, but sharper, louder, undeniably genuine. I stood up. We must conceal ourselves immediately. Be seated or you will face immediate expulsion. Professor Blackwood moved to obstruct the light switch. I will not forfeit my career because you children wish to engage in frivolous charades. Something within me fractured. I don't care. I sprinted towards the light switch. That's when chaos erupted. Half the class surged towards the designated safe corner. The other half remained frozen at their desks, torn between a lifetime of adhering to regulations and that primal instinct screaming, danger! Professor Blackwood lunged for my arm as I passed, but I wrenched free. She shrieked about insubordination and repercussions. You are all succumbing to mass hysteria. This paranoia is precisely what digital platforms have inflicted upon you. Manufactured fear? But we were no longer heeding her. Chairs scraped across the tile floor as we piled tables and furniture against the entryway. Someone was openly weeping. Another was murmuring prayers. The students who had been paralyzed finally scrambled over, cramming into our makeshift sanctuary. 23 teenagers striving to become invisible. Everyone except Professor Blackwood. She stood rigidly at her lectern, arms crossed, an aura of pure fury radiating from her. The doorknob rattled, every breath caught in our throats. The handle turned, locked. Thank the heavens. It was locked. A shadow passed beneath the door, paused. We could hear strained breathing on the other side. Or perhaps it was merely my own heart thudding against my ribs. Footsteps resumed, moving onward. Those felt like the longest 10 seconds of my life. The tactical response unit located us nearly an hour later. Professor Blackwood was still rambling about our collective overreaction to a mere exercise. And a week later, the full truth emerged. Because that's when they disclosed the identity of the shooter, Jasper Wells, a former student from my sophomore year literature class. The quiet individual who always sat in the rear, drawing fantastical creatures in his journal. The medic wrapped the pressure cuff around my arm as I sat on the mobile cot outside. My entire body shivered, as if afflicted by hypothermia. Despite it being late spring, She repeatedly checked my pulse and inquired about my breathing, but all I could envision was Jasper walking past our door. Jasper with a firearm. Jasper, to whom I'd loaned a writing utensil just last week. Inspector Shaw approached, displaying her credentials and notepad. She crouched to my eye level, requesting a sequential recounting of everything that transpired in Professor Blackwood's room. I recounted the initial alert. Professor Blackwood's insistence that we remain at our desks. The escalating sounds growing closer. She meticulously recorded every detail, nodding when I mentioned extinguishing the lights myself. The parking area was a maelstrom of parents rushing frantically, news vehicles establishing their positions, ambulances departing with wailing sirens. My mother burst through the police cordon, still in her hospital scrubs, mascara streaking her face as she clutched me so tightly I gasped for air. She repeatedly touched my face, my arms, searching for injuries that weren't present, while demanding answers from Inspector Shaw about how an instructor could leave students exposed during an active threat. Trevin's mother was also there, weeping and embracing him repeatedly while he stood, looking utterly blank. Inspector Shaw led me to a quieter zone and produced her tablet, displaying screenshots of my text exchange with Trevon about Professor Blackwood's refusal to allow us to conceal ourselves. She stated that 23 other students had already provided identical accounts, that Professor Blackwood persistently maintained it was a fabrication, even after the gunshots commenced. 2 adolescents perished in the mathematics corridor, she informed me. 3 more were hospitalized, all from classrooms that followed protocol immediately, save for one young woman who sustained a graze from a projectile that pierced a door. My father arrived and took over from my mother, guiding me to his truck without uttering a word. The stereo remained off throughout the drive home, and we both flinched when a motorcycle roared past us at a traffic signal. Our residence felt alien, too normal with its habitual aroma of coffee and laundry. My father prepared pasta with tomato sauce, but I merely pushed it around my plate as my device relentlessly buzzed with inquiries from everyone, questioning why Professor Blackwood hadn't allowed us to conceal ourselves. That night, sleep eluded me. I merely replayed those agonizing 60 minutes over and over. The following morning, an automated district message announced that academic operations were indefinitely suspended, and grief counselors would be available at the community center. My mother called in ill to remain home with me, but I secured my bedroom door and sat on my mattress, contemplating how narrowly we had avoided barricading, how nearly we had remained at our desks, as Professor Blackwood had commanded. The regional news network featured our academic institution during every commercial interval. And then, Professor Blackwood's visage filled the screen, standing in her driveway, asserting to the reporter that she had maintained absolute command during the crisis and that her students were alive because she hadn't succumbed to panic. My mother seized the remote control and hurled it with such force it fractured the screen. Trevon transmitted a digital link to a recording from someone's mobile device, captured within Instructor Price's darkened classroom. It depicted everyone hidden and silent, while Professor Blackwood's voice carried through the walls, enunciating her theories about manufactured fear. The temporal marker indicated 2:47 p.m., precisely when she was obstructing the light switch. The video accumulated 50,000 views in 2 hours, and the comments were scathing. I spent the ensuing day sequestered in my room, flinching whenever the dwelling creaked or an automobile door slammed outside. My mother delivered soup, which I did not consume, and the group message continually chimed about legal counsel and impending litigation, but I found myself unable to concentrate on any of it. Headmaster Thorne telephoned that evening, his voice adopting that characteristic careful tone, stating the district required my written deposition regarding Professor Blackwood's conduct, separate from the law enforcement inquiry. My mother seized the receiver and informed him I would provide it via our legal representative, which was news to me, as I was unaware we were retaining one. The next morning, Bodie Nolan's mother transported him to our residence because he felt an urgent need to converse with someone who had been present, someone who could comprehend. We settled on my front veranda, and he repeatedly initiated sentences he could not conclude. About almost remaining in his chair? About the potential consequences if I hadn't extinguished those lights. His hands trembled with the same tremor as mine. Trevin's parents dropped him off later that afternoon, and we proceeded directly to the rear garden where the picnic table was situated beneath the large oak tree. He rolled up his trousers and displayed the dark purple contusions covering both his knees, sustained when he'd wedged himself behind the chemical storage shelving in that supply closet. His voice remained toneless as he recounted how the gunshots incessantly drew closer, and he knew I was 2 corridors away, yet was utterly powerless to intervene. We sat there for an hour, not genuinely discussing the event, but equally avoiding any other topic, while his fingers absently picked at the splintered timber of the table. Day 5 commenced with my mother engaged in telephonic scheduling. By midday, she had secured the services of Rosalind Talbot, a legal expert specializing in institutional safety litigations. Her downtown office featured newspaper clippings adorning every wall, headlines detailing negligence suits and safety violations at educational establishments across the state. Rosalind reviewed my mother's notes and declared, Professor Blackwood's actions transcended poor judgment. Her maintenance of student exposure during an active threat situation constituted criminal endangerment. There is something profoundly disturbing in Professor Blackwood's persistent assertion that this entire event was simulated, even as actual gunshots echoed through the halls. What compels an educator to remain so convinced that actual peril is unreal when every other learning space is already darkened and concealed? She elaborated that other families were already initiating civil proceedings, but criminal charges would fall under the purview of the district attorney's office. The community assembly on day 6 devolved into pandemonium the moment Professor Blackwood entered the Civic Center doors alongside her union representative. Parents immediately erupted in shouts, while she merely stood there, retaining that same composed expression she had exhibited during the incident, reiterating that she had acted according to her professional discretion. Someone hurled a bottled beverage that struck the wall behind her, necessitating security personnel to form a protective cordon around her to escort her back outside. The inspector telephoned that same evening with a query that sent a chill through my entire body, asking if Professor Blackwood had ever mentioned Jasper Wells in class, given that he had been her student 3 years prior. Jasper Wells was the name whispered and texted among everyone, but which the news outlets had yet to officially release. Day 7, morning. I finally compelled myself to cleanse and change out of the garments I had worn for days. My father stood at the stove, preparing griddle cakes as if it were any ordinary Sunday, but we both started when the portal chime rang. It was merely the delivery service leaving a package. Yet, that fleeting second of apprehension was gradually becoming our new normalcy. That evening, the news definitively confirmed what everyone already surmised, displaying Jasper's graduating class photograph. This quiet young man I vaguely recalled from my initial year. The newscaster then dropped the true bombshell, stating that Wells had formally lodged a complaint against educator Patricia Blackwood 3 years earlier, citing psychological manipulation. My mother instantly seized her communication device to contact our legal counsel, while my father scoured online archives for any trace of Jasper's grievance. We located a school board meeting transcript from 2021 that referenced a sealed student complaint against personnel with dates that aligned perfectly, even though Professor Blackwood's name was not explicitly enumerated. Day 8, Trevin picked me up, and we drove to the deserted retail complex parking area, where we simply sat with the vehicle's engine dormant. His hands gripped the steering mechanism until his knuckles blanched, and he finally vocalized, she knew. She had to have known it might be him. And she still left us all vulnerable. Bodie commenced transmitting information to our class group message, details his guardians had uncovered. 3 other individuals from Jasper's graduating cohort recalled Professor Blackwood openly persecuting him. A young woman named Melinda recounted Professor Blackwood failing Jasper on a technicality that nearly jeopardized his graduation. And these narratives painted a distinct pattern of targeting specific students. Day 9, the inspector presented herself at our residence clutching a court order for Professor Blackwood's personnel dossier. She informed my mother they had made a discovery. That Jasper was not the sole complaint against Professor Blackwood over her career. There were 6 others, all sealed and somehow resolved without any punitive action taken. She required my detailed testimony concerning Professor Blackwood's precise utterances during the lockdown. Every single statement she had made while we pleaded with her to permit us to seek cover. I sat at my kitchen table with the inspector's blank deposition form before me, my writing instrument hovering above the paper while my mother prepared coffee in the background. The initial line requested a description of occurrences, and I inscribed 3 words before striking them out. Began anew? Cross that out too. How does one articulate the alteration in someone's vocal cadence when they have been in authority for so long they cannot conceive of being erroneous? The inspector waited patiently while I attempted 6 different formulations to elucidate how Professor Blackwood stood there, obstructing the light switch as we discerned those shots drawing nearer. I ultimately transcribed precisely what she articulated and performed, step by step. No subjective interpretations, merely empirical facts. Day 10. My mobile device chimed with a news alert while I was consuming breakfast. The academic board had placed Professor Blackwood on administrative leave pending inquiry, which sounded promising until I perused the educators' union statement beneath it, denouncing it as a precipitous judgment against a devoted mentor with 2.5 decades of service. The comment section already numbered 300 entries, half commending her as a heroine for preserving order, half advocating for her apprehension. My mother shut my portable computer and instructed me to cease reading, but I had already observed my designation mentioned 14 times. That afternoon, Headmaster Thorne appeared at our door, looking as though he hadn't slept in days. He sat on our sofa and stared at his hands while recounting to my mother the complaints accumulated over the years. Parents alleging Professor Blackwood was excessively rigid, unduly severe, but she possessed tenure, and her students consistently achieved high test scores. Consequently, nothing ever transpired. His voice wavered when he spoke of the 2 young lives that were lost. Day 11 commenced with my device vibrating incessantly at 6 a.m. because an individual had disseminated Jasper's detailed account to a news outlet before the Federal Bureau of Investigation could secure it. 3 entire pages dedicated to Professor Blackwood. How she had failed him on his senior dissertation due to a missing citation. How that singular mark had precluded his admission to his desired higher learning institution. How she had derided him when he requested an opportunity to rectify it. The particulars sent shivers down my spine. Dates and times and exchanges he had covertly recorded, constructing his rationale for why she deserved what was forthcoming. Our legal counsel, Rosalind, convened an urgent assembly that evening with all 23 families from Professor Blackwood's classroom crammed into a meeting chamber at the local inn. She stood at the forefront, clutching a stack of documents, and delivered the shocking revelation that the academic district was cognizant of Jasper's obsession with Professor Blackwood because his therapist had dispatched a warning 2 months prior to the incident. The room erupted with guardians shouting and weeping and clamoring for explanations, while Rosalind endeavored to expound upon mandatory reporting statutes and accountability. Day 12. I awoke to 47 social media notifications because Professor Blackwood had participated in an online broadcast titled Integrity in Instruction. and had spent an hour portraying herself as the casualty of progressive ideology and adolescent hysteria. She explicitly utilized my full designation, labeling me a troubled pupil with attendance irregularities, distorting my grandmother's memorial service into an excuse for me to absent myself from instruction for amusement. The interviewer persistently concurred with her, reiterating, "Youth today are fragile, incapable of handling structure, requiring sheltered environments instead of genuine pedagogy." Rosalind filed a formal cessation order within 2 hours, but the episode had already been downloaded 12,000 times. My social media feed inundated with unknown individuals labeling me a fabricator, an attention seeker, a crisis actor. Someone located my mother's professional contact at the medical facility and commenced telephoning the nursing station, inquiring if she felt pride in raising a progeny who destroys educators' careers. It was day 13. Trevin arrived with his sleeping bag and positioned himself on my bedroom floor, as neither of us could endure solitude any longer. We lay there in the encroaching darkness at 3 a.m., both wide awake, staring blankly. He incessantly replayed that day, how he could have activated the fire alarm from the chemistry chamber, how that would have initiated an evacuation before Jasper even commenced. The what-ifs gnawed at both of us, but there was nothing to articulate that would alleviate the torment. Professor Blackwood's brother-in-law, a prominent real estate magnate across the locale, initiated an online fundraising campaign for her legal defense the following morning that amassed 30,000 credits in 6 hours. The accompanying description characterized the situation as a witch hunt against a devoted educator. It included photographic evidence of her at graduation ceremonies with former protégés who had ascended to roles as medical practitioners and legal professionals, meticulously omitting anyone who did not conform to the established narrative. Individuals from 3 states away were contributing, and leaving remarks about how liberal ideologies were dismantling educational standards. Day 14, Bodhi's mother telephoned to disclose their withdrawal from the collective legal action. Her voice trembled as she elucidated that Bodhi's father's construction enterprise had inexplicably lost 3 significant contracts. She persistently asserted they could not definitively link the events, but everyone was aware that Professor Blackwood's brother-in-law managed the largest development corporation in the municipality and socialized with half the city council. Damian Hale, from my cohort, located me at the local coffee establishment that afternoon, his mobile device already extended and trembling in his grasp as he slid into the seat opposite me. He had been concealed in the primary administrative office during the entire incident, pressed behind the receptionist's desk where he possessed a clear view of the security monitor, and he had recorded the entire sequence on his device without conscious thought. The footage was granular, yet sufficiently clear to discern Professor Blackwood traversing the corridor 30 seconds after the initial gunshots. Not fleeing, not ducking, merely ambulating as if it were any ordinary interval between academic sessions. While Instructor Price's portal was already fortified, and Professor Grayson had her charges concealed beneath desks. Damien transmitted it to Inspector Shaw, directly in front of me, his digits moving so rapidly they repeatedly missed the correct inputs. Day 15, I returned to therapeutic consultation for the first time since my middle school years, consequent to my parents' separation. Dr. Patel's office retained the same artificial flora and monochromatic walls, and that white noise device that purportedly induced tranquility, but merely evoked the sensation of static. I recounted the amorphous shadow beneath the portal and how I perpetually hear Professor Blackwood declaring our hysteria while individuals were perishing down the corridor. She meticulously recorded notations on her yellow pad and requested I articulate the somatic sensations I experienced upon recollection. Damien's footage materialized on the prevalent social media platform before the evening meal that same day, and by midnight, the designation Blackwood Exposed was trending with 40,000 retransmissions. Individuals incessantly slowed the playback and digitally magnified portions where one could discern her consulting her mobile device while other educators were dragging students into learning spaces. The temporal marker was unequivocally clear, demonstrating this occurred subsequent to the commencement of the incident. News vehicles converged upon Damien's dwelling, compelling his parents to relocate him to his aunt's residence in a distant city. Day 16. Inspector Shaw summoned me to review the footage with a specialized analyst from the regional authority who repeatedly indicated points on the screen with her writing implement. She demonstrated the absence of any startle reflex when the discharges occurred. No discernible surprise on Professor Blackwood's countenance, merely a calm, deliberate decision to continue her promenade. They were constructing a legal argument for willful endangerment, she stated, which could entail up to 5 years of custodial sentence. My mother retrieved me from the precinct and drove directly to the district's central administration, where she completed the necessary documentation to withdraw me for home-based instruction. Professor Blackwood's placid stroll down the hallway while other educators barricaded portals was the precise detail that caused legal professionals to anticipate remunerative opportunities and insurance entities to prepare disbursements. My mother utilized 3 weeks of accumulated leave she had reserved for years and declared that my tertiary applications were secondary to my continued existence. We both ultimately wept in the kitchen while the boiling past flowed over the rim of the pot on the stove. Day 17. Professor Blackwood's legal counsel convened a major press conference on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by 3 of her former students, impeccably dressed in formal attire. One was now a state legislator who persistently iterated about precipitous judgment and pledged an inquiry into the inquiry. Concurrently, the legal representative asserted the footage was manipulated and demanded independent forensic analysis. Trevon's parents did not await any such developments and transferred him to a private academy the very same day. His mother explained their inability to await the systemic resolution of the matter. He relentlessly communicated with me from his new academic environment, feeling a pervasive guilt about his departure. Despite my persistent exhortations for him to escape while he could, our communication devices became a vital lifeline. Both of us awakening at 3 a.m. and exchanging messages merely to ascertain the other's continued presence. Day 18. Sleep remained elusive, prompting me to search online for information concerning Professor Blackwood. I discovered an antiquated online forum from 2019 where an individual had posed the query, "Who is your worst educator?" 3 distinct accounts specifically named her, detailing her psychological manipulations and her annual selection of a single student to torment. The thread had since been expunged, but the archived version remained accessible via a historical web repository. Consequently, I captured screenshots of everything and transmitted them to our legal representative. Day 19. The academic board meeting descended into absolute pandemonium as guardians began screaming at one another across the assembly hall. Half of them demanded Professor Blackwood's immediate arrest, while the other half believed she was being unjustly scapegoated, with one woman vociferously asserting that Professor Blackwood had salvaged those youths by maintaining order. Bodhi's father rose, despite their withdrawal from the legal proceedings, and shouted back that she had nearly caused their demise, necessitating security to clear the entire chamber while individuals continued to push and shove in the parking vicinity. Rosalind Hale, Damien's mother, filed for a protective order the following morning after Professor Blackwood's adherents commenced appearing at our residences, capturing photographic images of our entryways and disseminating them online with our addresses. The adjudicator, however, stated that in the absence of direct threats, it constituted constitutionally protected expression. Rosalind sat in the courtroom, openly weeping, while the adjudicator elucidated that capturing images from public property was not illicit. That same night, unable to sleep, I continuously scrolled through my mobile device, perusing all the comments defending Professor Blackwood. Around 3 a.m., something within me simply snapped. I seized my portable computer and commenced accessing the audio recordings from that day that the news outlets had disseminated. The temporal sequence was now public record, thanks to the inquiry. I synchronized Professor Blackwood's precise utterances with the background sounds of gunfire. Positioning my mobile device against my desk luminaire, I initiated recording and simply began reading from the transcript. "I have not sanctioned any lockdown protocol today." Bang! Echoed from my portable computer speakers. "Be seated or you will all receive failing marks." Bang! Bang! My hands trembled, but I persisted through every single statement she made while young lives were being extinguished down the corridor. When I posted it to the popular short-form video platform at 4:17 a.m., I anticipated no significant impact. By midday, it had garnered 2 million views and was rapidly ascending. Other students from the institution commenced creating their own video chronicles, demonstrating their educators' responses. Professor Grayson from the linguistics department had everyone concealed beneath desks within 8 seconds. Instructor Price had his entire class sequestered in the storage closet prior to the second alert. Coach Williams literally physically transported 2 first-year students who had frozen into the equipment room. Every single educator, save for Professor Blackwood, had their charges protected within 30 seconds. The topical tags exploded across every digital platform. Teachers, as protectors, showcased heroic actions while Blackwood chose control, depicted our learning space still occupied by students at their desks as gunshots reverberated. That night, around 2 a.m., Trevon arrived at my dwelling unannounced. His mother had discovered him experiencing a panic attack in his bathing chamber and had driven him over. We sat in my drive until the sun ascended, sharing audio devices and listening to antiquated music compilations from before everything changed. He repeatedly whispered the same phrase over and over like a supplication. The district attorney's office convened a press conference the following morning. 23 counts of reckless endangerment of a minor, 1 for each student in our class. Professor Blackwood surrendered herself, attired in a dark suit with all her teaching accolades pinned to her lapel like military decorations. The cameras captured every moment as she ascended those courthouse steps, her chin held high and a faint smile playing on her lips. Her bail hearing occurred that afternoon, and the adjudicator set it at 50,000 credits. Her adherents initiated an online fundraising campaign before she was even processed. 2 hours and 17 minutes was all it required to accrue the full amount. She emerged from that courthouse still smiling and halted directly before the cameras. My mother had to seize both my arms and physically restrain me, dragging me back to the vehicle when Professor Blackwood commenced speaking of vindication and authority. The victims' families commenced meeting at the community center on designated days, but I found myself unable to attend. My mother went instead and returned with swollen eyes every single occasion. She would simply embrace me more tightly than usual and remain silent about what she had heard there. Bodhi transmitted a photographic image of something his mother had discovered while organizing antiquated Parent-Teacher Association documents from her garage. Jasper Wells's junior year essay with Professor Blackwood's comments profusely inscribed in red ink. The essay appeared perfectly adequate to me, but her annotations were brutal, denigrating lazy cogitation and disappointing endeavor. At the bottom, in her flawlessly precise handwriting, she had appended a note concerning a discussion of his future within her course. Inspector Shaw telephoned me the subsequent day, stating they had unearthed 6 additional grievances against Professor Blackwood dating back 15 years. All originated from male students, and all referenced something the parents termed psychological manipulation. Every single grievance was dismissed following closed-door consultations with administrative personnel. The inspector's voice sounded weary when she informed me this was not uncommon in such cases. Headmaster Thorne tendered his resignation at an emergency press conference that no one anticipated. He stood at that podium and explicitly admitted his failure to protect us. He stated that Professor Blackwood should have been removed years prior, but he had chosen the path of least resistance instead. The reporter seemed visibly astonished that someone was, for once, accepting accountability. 2 days later, Professor Blackwood's legal counsel initiated a countersuit against the academic district for 5 million credits. They asserted the district was scapegoating her for its own security deficiencies. My mobile device chimed with the news alert while I was in my therapist's waiting area, and I actually laughed aloud at the sheer audaciousness. The following day, Rosalind convened an assembly at the community center, and all 23 families appeared. She stood at the forefront with stacks of documents and began distributing them while explaining we were no longer merely defending ourselves. We were filing criminal complaints with the state board and initiating a federal civil rights litigation. Parents were affixing signatures to papers and exchanging contact information, while Rosalind's assistant meticulously recorded notes on her portable computer. That night, unable to sleep, I commenced transcribing everything into an antiquated notebook I discovered in my desk drawer. Every utterance Professor Blackwood made during those 47 minutes was meticulously recorded on the page. The manner in which she obstructed the light switch, how she menaced us with failing marks and expulsion as gunshots drew nearer. Dr. Patel had stated, writing facilitates trauma processing, but it felt more akin to constructing a legal brief. 3 days later, my mobile device began vibrating with notifications about a newly launched web presence. A collective of Professor Blackwood's former students had established a platform designated Survivors of Room 203. I clicked the link and observed testimonial after testimonial pouring in. 37 narratives within the initial few days alone. Individuals from a decade prior describing identical stratagems. Public humiliation when her authority was challenged. Academic grades mysteriously plummeting if her dominion was questioned. Psychological maneuvers that instilled self-doubt. The discernible pattern was overtly evident for all to behold. A local journalist reached out through my mother, inquiring about an interview. My hands trembled as the camera commenced recording, but I maintained a steady vocal tone and recounted precisely what transpired. How she regarded us while gunshots echoed in the corridor, choosing her authority over our very lives. The segment aired that evening, and my mobile device did not cease vibrating for hours. Bodhi surprised everyone the following day by posting his personal account on social media, despite his parents' earnest pleas for him not to. He articulated about nearly remaining seated because he harbored greater apprehension of Professor Blackwood's retribution than of mortality itself. He stated, I preserved my life by defying her. Within 3 hours, his post had garnered 10,000 shares and was rapidly escalating. The Federal Bureau of Investigation agent contacted my parents that afternoon with new intelligence they had unearthed. Jasper had transmitted a message to a confidant the night prior to the incident, detailing Professor Blackwood's public dismantling of him. The confidant had expunged the messages due to culpability, but investigators had recovered them from the telecommunication company's servers. The messages were explicit concerning Jasper's intentions and his profound antipathy towards Professor Blackwood. 2 days later, news broke that Professor Blackwood's spouse had initiated divorce proceedings and had vacated their shared residence in the dead of night. Court documents revealed he had been planning this for months, but the incident had accelerated his timeline. Even her own partner was abandoning the vessel. I was compelled to return to the academic institution to retrieve my personal effects as the semester was concluding. Room 203 remained sealed with investigative tape draped across the portal. The corridor felt discordant and emitted the pervasive odor of industrial cleanser, attempting to mask something else entirely. I gathered my belongings from my assigned locker with utmost celerity while Trevin awaited in the parking area, his vehicle's engine idling. The prosecution introduced an expert named Dr. Kaylin Markham, specializing in crisis response. She dedicated 3 days to reviewing all pertinent documentation, and her conclusion was devastating. Professor Blackwood had violated every single established protocol and exhibited gross negligence that directly imperiled our lives. Professor Blackwood's adherence, raising 50,000 credits in merely 2 hours, caused me to ponder the precise individuals possessing such financial resources and motivation to defend an educator who kept students seated during a firearm incident. Her report comprised 50 pages of specialized terminology, essentially stating Professor Blackwood prioritized control over children. Then, Professor Blackwood's adherents elected to organize a public demonstration at the courthouse, which swiftly degenerated into disarray. Parents of the 2 students who had succumbed to their injuries appeared as counter-protesters. When an individual vociferated that Blackwood had committed no transgression, one of the grieving mothers simply collapsed, sobbing on the courthouse steps. The photographic image went globally viral within minutes, visually depicting our municipality irrevocably polarized. News vehicles from 3 distant states began converging upon the scene. Trevon's mother organized a therapeutic support session at the community center that weekend where 23 of us survivors gathered in a circle of collapsible chairs. The young woman from Instructor Price's class continuously twisted her hair around her digit as she recounted how their educator immediately inverted desks to fashion a defensive barrier. Another student from the science wing described his educator pulling them into the chemical storage compartment and obstructing the portal with a filing cabinet. Everyone shared an identical narrative, save for us. Their educators protected them. Ours actively endangered us. One young woman merely looked at me and articulated, "We should not have been compelled to rescue ourselves." And everyone nodded in solemn agreement. The State Board of Education finally initiated their formal inquiry on day 35, after the media scrutiny became excessively intense. Rosalind telephoned me that afternoon to state they were issuing subpoenas for a decade's worth of records from the academic district. She stated that investigators had discovered 17 formal grievances against Professor Blackwood that were never appropriately documented. Criminal charges against the administrative personnel who had enabled her were now under consideration. My mother arranged a supper gathering with Trevon's family that night, where we all sat around their dining table, merely pushing sustenance around our plates. Trevon's father persistently endeavored to discuss his plans for a tertiary education the following year, but the words merely hung suspended in the air. His mother mentioned concepts for summer recreation, but halted mid-sentence when an automobile backfired outside, and we all flinched. We were all feigning that we were not irrevocably altered, that loud percussive sounds did not induce paralysis, that shadows did not accelerate our cardiac rhythms. On day 40, I found myself at the state capitol edifice with a microphone positioned before me and 300 individuals in the audience. The legislative committee sat behind their elongated desk, making notations while I read from my prepared statement. I informed them Professor Blackwood had weaponized her authority while a literal weapon was present within our academic institution. I stated she had prioritized her ego above our very existences. I inquired how many grievances it required before action was taken. The representatives merely stared at me when I concluded. 2 days later, a facilities custodian named Finch contacted our legal representative with an immense discovery. He possessed surveillance footage from 3 years prior that no one was aware existed because it originated from an antiquated camera system they had neglected to decommission. The footage depicted Jasper departing Professor Blackwood's learning space with tears streaming down his countenance before striking a partition with such force his knuckles bled. The temporal marker precisely aligned with the day Jasper had formally lodged his grievance against her. The original inquiry had never incorporated this footage because no one had thought to inspect the legacy system. Bodie's family telephoned us on day 42 to announce their rejoining of the litigation. His father's corporation mysteriously regained all those contracts the very same day the Federal Bureau of Investigation commenced investigating Professor Blackwood's brother-in-law for tampering with evidence. His father declared that certain principles transcended pecuniary gain. But we all comprehended the truth. The brother-in-law capitulated when federal agents presented themselves at his office. The grand jury convened the subsequent week and elevated Professor Blackwood's charges to attempted murder through depraved indifference. Her legal counsel appeared on news broadcasts denouncing it as prosecutorial overreach. But the district attorney held a press conference explaining that maintaining children's exposure during an active threat situation demonstrated extreme disregard for human life. Legal experts on television stated this charge typically applied only to fatalities resulting from impaired driving, but this case might establish a novel legal precedent. Trevon received his early admission notification to the state university on day 45, but telephoned them that afternoon to defer for a gap year. He came over that night, and we sat on my veranda while he elucidated that he could not abandon me to confront the judicial proceedings alone. We both knew what we shared was no longer typical adolescent experience. We were linked by something darker now, something that transcended affection into shared survival. Day 47 marked my first genuinely positive day since the incident. I endured 6 complete hours without dwelling upon it while assisting my mother in reorganizing the storage area. Then the culpability struck me with crushing force. How could I forget, even for a solitary minute, when 2 young lives had been extinguished? Dr. Patel stated that healing was not a linear progression during our session, but it felt like a profound betrayal. It felt as though I was abandoning the young individuals who did not emerge. The State Board conducted their hearing on day 50 to permanently rescind Professor Blackwood's teaching certification. She appeared in a dark ensemble, asserting this was a lynching of a devoted educator. When they presented testimonials from 37 former students describing her conduct, she dismissed them as weak children, incapable of enduring high standards. Several board members visibly recoiled from their microphones. The presiding official was compelled to call for order twice when Professor Blackwood commenced shouting about cancellation culture. They voted unanimously to permanently revoke her certification and referred the case to the Attorney General for additional charges related to child endangerment spanning her entire professional career. The ensuing weeks passed in a haze of legal consultations and therapeutic sessions until Inspector Shaw telephoned me on day 52 with information that caused my hands to tremble so violently I dropped my device. She had been delving through antiquated personnel dossiers at the district's central administration when she uncovered a sealed folder from 2009 concerning Professor Blackwood's reassignment from Westfield Academy. A student there had attempted self-harm and had left a 3-page note explicitly naming Professor Blackwood for the daily humiliation and psychological manipulations that had driven her to that extreme. The institution quietly transferred Professor Blackwood to our district rather than initiating an inquiry because the superintendent's spouse was Professor Blackwood's cousin. Within hours of Inspector Shaw's confidential disclosure to a journalistic associate, my mobile device began vibrating with notifications from a social media group titled Survivors of Professor Blackwood that already boasted 200 members. Former students from 3 distinct academic institutions were sharing narratives spanning 25 years about her stratagems. The public shaming, the deliberate issuance of contradictory directives followed by punishment for perceived confusion, the psychological gaslighting of students concerning statements or actions she had made minutes earlier. One young woman from 1998 recorded that Professor Blackwood informed her she was too unintelligent for higher education in front of the entire class, then denied it when her parents lodged a complaint. Another student from 2003 stated Professor Blackwood made him stand before the class while she enumerated every flaw in his essay, including mocking his speech impediment. The pattern was consistently identical, perpetually shielded by administrative personnel who found it more expedient to transfer her than to address formal grievances. 2 days later, my mother drove me to meet the Jensen and Green families, whose progeny, Mateo and Selena, had perished in the incident because they had remained at their desks, adhering to Professor Blackwood's commands. Mrs. Jensen clasped my hand as tears streamed down her countenance and stated she did not attribute blame to any of us survivors. Mr. Green's voice cracked as he informed me, "We fought to preserve ourselves while their children never received the opportunity because they followed the regulations." We sat in their living space, weeping collectively for an hour, scrutinizing photographic images of Mateo and Selena at their formal dance just 3 weeks prior to their demise. Rosalind telephoned that afternoon with updates on the prosecution's strategy, and what she imparted to me caused me to rush to the bathing chamber and vomit. They possessed evidence that Professor Blackwood knew Jasper was likely targeting her based on prior incidents where he had confronted her after class, but she deliberately kept us exposed as a form of psychological torment. The prosecutors were poised to argue she utilized us as human shields for her ego, that she would rather jeopardize our lives than concede her error regarding the lockdown protocol. The truth was more horrifying than any of us had previously conceived, that she perceived us as mere props in her power dynamic, even with an armed assailant present within the building. By day 56, the academic district's legal counsel were in a state of complete panic and tendered a 30 million credit settlement to be distributed among all the affected families, admitting no culpability, but acknowledging systemic failures and oversight. Some families immediately accepted, unable to endure years of prolonged legal skirmishes. But my parents and 12 other families persevered, seeking criminal accountability, not merely financial compensation. Trevon picked me up 2 days later to visit the memorial that had proliferated outside the academic institution. Hundreds of floral arrangements and plush toys and photographic images adorned the main entry steps. Someone had left a duplicate of the students' regulations manual with the lockdown procedures conspicuously highlighted in yellow, and attached notation stating these regulations preserve lives when educators adhere to them. We stood there, hands clasped, perusing all the messages individuals had left when Trevon discerned something that caused him to squeeze my digits so intensely it pained me. Between 2 bouquets was a printed copy of Jasper's manifesto, to which the defense teams had just gained access. 5 pages meticulously detailing Professor Blackwood's instructional methodologies like a manual for psychological torment. He documented the public humiliation, the deliberately ambiguous instructions followed by retribution for non-compliance, the psychological manipulation concerning statements or actions she had made, example after example with specific dates and corroborating witnesses. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had verified every incident he described through interviews with former students. That same week, Professor Blackwood's former instructional assistant from 2015 finally broke her silence in an interview with a local news outlet. She had resigned after 1 semester because she could no longer bear witness to Professor Blackwood's treatment of students, having even reported it to Headmaster Thorne. But no action was taken because Professor Blackwood possessed tenure, and the union would vigorously contest any disciplinary measures. Another administrative figure who chose the convenient path over safeguarding young lives, another adult who could have prevented this years ago. Bodhi's deposition occurred on day 62, and his parents later transmitted the transcript to me because they were immensely proud of his remarkable fortitude. His voice apparently never faltered when he stated, "Professor Blackwood instructed us that authority superseded safety. But that day, I demonstrated to everyone that survival is the sole paramount concern." The prosecutor inquired if he blamed me for defying Professor Blackwood. And Bodhi responded that I was the only adult in that chamber who had behaved as one, that a 17-year-old young woman had exhibited greater leadership than an individual with 25 years of pedagogical experience. The Federal Bureau of Investigation appeared at Professor Blackwood's brother-in-law's residence the following morning with a warrant for witness tampering and obstruction of justice, having apprehended him via wiretap, threatening Bodhi's father's business partners if Bodhi did not alter his testimony. Her entire network of support was disintegrating as individuals realized the lengths she had gone to protect herself, hiring private investigators to unearth compromising information on students' families, employing her brother-in-law to pressure anyone who might testify against her. 2 weeks later, I sat at our kitchen table with Rosalind, the prosecutor, spreading out pages of notes for my victim impact statement. She pushed a legal pad towards me and instructed me not to withhold anything because the jury needed to comprehend every single action Professor Blackwood took that day. Trevon sat beside me, his hand resting on my knee beneath the table as I inscribed the narrative of how she had kept us at our desks while an armed individual traversed the corridors. I wrote until my hand cramped, then typed on my portable computer, then wrote some more. The words emerged angrily at first, then sadly, then simply with a profound weariness. Rosalind perused my draft and nodded, asserting that this would assist the jury in discerning the unvarnished truth. 2 days later, the court clerk telephoned to state the judicial proceeding was scheduled for 3 months hence. 3 entire months of agonizing anticipation, I attempted to revert to customary activities like standardized test preparation and tertiary applications. But how does one articulate future aspirations when one so narrowly escaped having no future whatsoever? The common application essay prompt inquired about a challenge I had surmounted, and I simply stared at the blank page for hours. Then, on day 70, my mobile device vibrated with a flurry of messages from Bodhi. Professor Blackwood had transmitted an electronic communication to his parents stating their son was confused about what had transpired and suggesting they seek therapeutic intervention for him to remember correctly. The prosecutor had her apprehended within 2 hours. News vehicles converged upon her residence and captured her being escorted out in handcuffs while she vociferated about being persecuted for maintaining order. The adjudicator convened an emergency hearing the subsequent morning. I sat in the gallery observing as the prosecutor presented the electronic communication and elucidated how Professor Blackwood had violated her bail conditions by contacting witnesses. The adjudicator did not even permit her legal counsel to complete his argument before revoking her bail. Court officers advanced towards her, and she rose swiftly, knocking over her glass of water. For the first time since this entire ordeal commenced, I witnessed genuine terror in her eyes as they restrained her. She looked directly at me as they escorted her past the gallery, and I could perceive the dawning realization that she was no longer in command. 2 nights later, my mother discovered me at the kitchen table at 3 a.m., enveloped by drafts of tertiary essays. My common application essay detailed the day I chose to survive, despite my educator's directives. My mother read over my shoulder and stated I was not obligated to compose about this if it proved too arduous. I informed her that I was, because this was irrevocably who I now was. We both comprehended I would never again be the person I was before that fateful day. The judicial proceedings commenced 3 months later on a brisk Monday morning. The prosecutor's opening statement included the playback of the audio from my mobile device that I had been recording for an academic project. One could discern the gunshots drawing nearer, students weeping, and Professor Blackwood's voice, clear as day, stating we were being hysterical and manufacturing fear. Several jurors instinctively placed their hands over their mouths. Professor Blackwood sat at the defense table in a gray suit, still comporting herself as the aggrieved party. The subsequent day, I provided testimony for 4 continuous hours. The prosecutor guided me through every second of those 60 minutes, prompting me to describe everyone's seating arrangement, Professor Blackwood's statements, how she obstructed the light switch. Her legal counsel endeavored to portray me as a rebellious youth who simply harbored an aversion to authority. But I maintained my composure and merely reiterated the facts. When he inquired why I had defied an educator's direct order, I looked at the jury and stated I chose to live while she chose her ego. No one uttered a sound for approximately 10 seconds. On day 3, Trevin took the stand and recounted receiving my messages about concealing myself in that supply closet, fully cognizant of my peril. His voice cracked as he described the moment he believed I had perished because I ceased responding. Professor Blackwood's legal counsel objected, labeling it emotional manipulation. But the adjudicator stated the jury needed to comprehend the trauma she inflicted by maintaining student exposure. Trevon was compelled to take 3 pauses to regain his composure. Day 4 irrevocably altered everything. The prosecution had technologically enhanced the surveillance footage audio using advanced federal investigative techniques, and one could discern statements previously indiscernible. At the temporal marker, 9:47 a.m., immediately following the initial discharges, Professor Blackwood's voice resonated with crystalline clarity, stating, "If this is real, they deserve what they get for not respecting me." A juror actually gasped audibly. Even her own legal counsel appeared visibly shocked because this was not present in any of the discovery materials. The adjudicator was compelled to call a recess when guardians in the gallery commenced vociferating. Day 5. Professor Blackwood elected to provide testimony against her legal counsel's advisement. She sat in the witness box, persistently asserting she had maintained perfect order, that we were never in actual peril, that she was being persecuted for upholding standards. She stated she was safeguarding us from panic and that running aimlessly would have been more dangerous. The prosecutor permitted her to speak for 20 minutes, then posed a singular query that rendered the entire courtroom silent. "Did you recognize Jasper Wells's voice when he was in the corridor outside your learning space?" Professor Blackwood froze completely, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. After perhaps 15 seconds, she whispered, "Yes." The courtroom erupted with individuals shouting and weeping, and the adjudicator was compelled to repeatedly strike his gavel to reassert control. The prosecutor slowly rose after tranquility was restored and walked directly up to Professor Blackwood's face. She posed the question everyone was contemplating, but no one wished to hear articulated aloud. Did Professor Blackwood know it was Jasper Wells in that corridor? The same Jasper Wells who filed 3 grievances against her last year? Professor Blackwood's hand commenced trembling, and her countenance transitioned from crimson to pallid to ashen in approximately 5 seconds. The entire courtroom held its collective breath, awaiting her response. Finally, she fractured and commenced shouting about how Jasper needed to acquire respect, precisely as all of us did. The jury members exchanged wide-eyed glances, and one woman in the rear row began openly weeping. 3 weeks later, we all reconvened for the verdict pronouncement, and the tension was palpable, like electricity in the air. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, but when they returned, they found her guilty on all counts. 23 charges of placing young individuals in peril, plus something termed depraved indifference that sounded even more heinous. Professor Blackwood collapsed into her chair when the verdict was read, and for the first time, she appeared terrified instead of incensed. The adjudicator stated she could receive up to 25 years, and the families of the 3 adolescents who had perished began openly sobbing. 2 weeks thereafter, I was compelled to read my victim impact statement at the sentencing. My hands perspired so profusely I could barely grip the paper, but I forced myself to look directly at her as I spoke. I informed her she had taught me that being in authority without exercising sagacity was perilous, that attempting to control individuals without genuine care was merely cruelty. I stated I would carry those 60 minutes with me perpetually, but she would be compelled to bear the burden of her chosen actions. The adjudicator sentenced her to 18 years with a possibility of parole after 12. When the guards affixed the restraints, she turned to all of us and asserted she was merely upholding standards. Even then, she did not comprehend. And that was perhaps the most agonizing part of all. A month later, Trevin and I sat in his vehicle observing workers installing new reinforced entryways and upgraded surveillance systems at the academic institution. We were irrevocably altered now, bound together by what had transpired, but also fundamentally different within ourselves. Trevin took my hand and stated, "We survived." And this time, it was not a query. Bodhi attended the academic board meeting that spring and delivered a profoundly impactful address about rectifying their process for handling educator complaints. His voice was strong and clear, utterly unlike the terrified young man who had nearly remained in his seat that day. He stated, "No student should be compelled to choose between their academic performance and their very survival." I commenced my studies at the State University that autumn, specializing in educational policy, because someone needs to rectify these systemic issues. My fellow resident was unaware of what had transpired, and for a few weeks, I was merely Bryn Archer, instead of the incident girl. It felt liberating, yet also peculiar, retaining such a momentous event within me. They reopened room 203 as a memorial learning space in November and invited me to speak at the dedication ceremony. Standing where Professor Blackwood once stood felt profoundly strange, but I conveyed to everyone that protecting young lives transcends mere locks and drills. It is fundamentally about heeding their voices when they articulate that something is amiss. My mother drove me home for the winter recess, and we passed the academic institution where young individuals were engaged in a basketball game as if nothing untoward had ever occurred there. I remarked to her that they appeared so youthful, and she responded that we all did back then. We both knew I would never again possess that particular innocence because innocence was another casualty of that day. Trevin and I met at our customary coffee establishment when we were both home from our respective institutions for the holidays. We still instinctively checked for egress points and flinched when someone dropped a tray, but we were gradually learning to coexist with these new realities. Trevin clasped my hand and stated we were now composing new chapters, which sounded cliched, yet resonated as truth. The indelible marks would always persist, but we were more than what transpired in room 203. We were the young individuals who refused to remain in our seats when standing up meant enduring.